Shawna and Jody here with Real Sisters, Real Talk.
We're glad to have you joining us as we talk about growing in our faith with God. Hello and welcome back to Real Sisters, Real Talk. We are in the studio. Shawna and I are here together in California, and so we're really excited for our time together for a few weeks.
Yay.
So Shawna, what's the best thing you've done since you've been here in California? What's the funnest thing you've gotten to do?
Okay, so this is kind of a new discovery for myself, but I live for meaningful connection. So when I say, how are you? I mean, how's your soul?
Yes.
How are you really? How are you? It's not like an in-passing
right
thing.
I just have to tell you, Shawna is staying at our house for these last couple of days. She was at our sister Kelly's for the first couple of days with her family. But those are our sweet moments, like coffee in the morning, a good chance for those conversations.
Yeah. So I would say the best thing was this morning. We probably had a half an hour where it was just you and me and a cup of coffee and real conversation.
Yeah.
And that does my heart so good.
Me too. I thought you were going to say beach, so I like that answer.
No, it was you.
Yeah. No, that's really sweet. It's been good to have you here and have those heart talks.
It is.
And that not just the catch up, but the get to the meat.
Yeah,
that's a gift.
And another thing, bigger picture, if I were to zoom out, that's been going on is God is reminding me of something that he called me to, something that he told me to do.
Yeah.
A big project for me to take on. And Jodes, I think it was 2 years ago this time.
I think it was 2. We talked a little bit about this morning, and we both kind of got an invitation by the Lord at different times in different ways. And yes, so you were kind of processing that little piece of how you're walking in that. So
right. So, and it's funny because when you say an invitation, I have my spirit. I got to check in my spirit, Jody. And the check in my spirit is, he's the King of Kings. He's the Lord of Lords.
Invitation.
It's a command. And I know it's something that I'm supposed to be obedient to, not something
if you wanna.
Yeah. So God said, Shawna, I want you to move into this thing. You as well, right? There's this project I want you to move into. And my first thing was oh, that's so big, so much bigger than me. And I don't have what it takes to be able to do that. And then it was oh, God has called me to do this exciting thing. And if he called me, he's going to equip me.
Yeah.
And then I think in the process, I started to step into it in obedience and do what he called me to do. And the more that I walked out the obedience, the more I realized, oh, I really don't have what it takes to do this.
I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah. And so there has been a very deliberate, intentional, delayed obedience. And at my house, delayed obedience is disobedience.
Right?
If I tell you to take the trash out on Monday and you have great intentions, but it's Friday and you still haven't taken the trash out,
that is disobedience.
We've got a problem. And it's not just your obedience, it's our stinky house because the trash has been sitting there for days.
But how come that's okay for us?
I don't know.
We think that,
I'm
getting to it, or I'm going to do that, or I put it on my calendar to get that done, Lord. And yet he doesn't say, think about it, talk about it, plan for it, just do it. And why is that so hard?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know why it's so hard, probably because I feel so incapable and I just feel like I don't have everything I need. It feels bigger than me, but I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that God is saying, Shawna, I want you to step into this project. There was even a moment, Jodes, if I'm totally honest, there was even a moment where I was like, yeah, I probably missed that window. God told me to do that, but then I didn't do it. So I'll just wait for the next thing.
Yeah.
And I feel like the Lord is reminding me in the sweet ways that he does that, right? Through conversations, through a prompting, just even remembering, having it come back into my mind. Yes, I've not been intentionally setting aside time to work on this project that God told me he wanted me to be about.
Right. I wonder if, I can say this for me, sometimes I feel like because I don't know the end result, I don't know how to get to that end piece, it's hard for me to be obedient in doing what I'm called to do today. But God doesn't have to reveal how to do all of it. You know, we've talked about this before with the podcast. When we both felt called to do this podcast together, it was absolutely something that we feel like God said, this is what I want you to do. And neither one of us had any idea how to do it.
It was bigger than us.
It was way bigger than us. And we didn't even know that we didn't know.
Yeah.
Like it was that much of a big thing. But God didn't give us the next piece until we needed the next piece. And so I think with this big project that we're both feeling, individually led to do, called to do by God.
Mm-hmm. Right.
There's this but I don't know how to get that to the end piece. And that is a constant reminder. I feel like God is saying, I don't need you to know that. I told you to do this part of the project now, do that. So in the lack of obedience is the lack of the next piece given to us.
Come on. That's so good.
Right.
Every single time God has opened up something for me, it's been a doorway that enters into a room that has another door.
Yeah.
And then there's another obedience and I walk through that door and it leads farther down the road. So if as I am delaying the obedience, I'm also delaying what's around the corner for me.
Which, why would we do that? Like, if we actually look at it with that perspective, there's no way we would make that choice. And yet here we are.
I think one of the reasons why, and you can push back on this if you want to,
check.
but I think one of the reasons that we don't step into obedience right away is because we're in a season in time in Christian culture where we celebrate revelation. Woohoo! God told me.
Yes.
Woohoo! God told me. And we don't celebrate the obedience, the work of what God told you to do.
No, for sure. Oh, and the obedience is work. Mm-hmm. And so who wants to do that when we can just celebrate the revelation, the excitement?
Right.
God
God spoke.
Yeah.
And which makes me think of the story of the two houses. Right? One was built on rock, one was built on sand. And the story that was being told there is there are two people and they both hear a revelation from God. The wise person is the one who does something about it. But they both heard it.
Yep.
So the wisdom, the benefit, the security is not found in hearing from God, but in our obedience to what he said.
It's the next step of hearing from God. As we hear from him, we need to act on it.
Yeah.
I guess it just comes back to that. We talk about this too. Like anything we do is in response to God. We can love because he first loved us. So when we hear from God, we actually want to do our part. So it's not a matter of, I need to be obedient so that God will love me. Right. That's not what we're talking about here.
Right.
We are talking about God has given a command, and in my love for him and in my relationship with him, and he's the God of the universe, I'm to be obedient. Mm-hmm. Not just say, well, that's a nice idea, Lord, but I'm going to do this, right?
And I think another reason why we don't step into obedience, because now you got me thinking along that track. So another thing that I think keeps us from it is that I think we've bought into this idea that we talked about being still and being with the Lord. I think we bought into this idea of when I pull away and I sit and I'm in the quiet and I sit with the Lord, that's where I get nourished. That's where I get fed. That's where my strength comes from to step out and do the work. But there was a time that Jesus was traveling with the disciples, and the disciples, he sent them on to get food, and they're like, oh, you need to eat. I think I might be mixing up stories at this point, so correct me if I don't have it all accurate. But he said, oh, I have food that you know nothing about. My food is to do the will of the Father. He didn't say my food is to sit in the quiet with the Father. He said my food, like my nourishment, comes from obedience. So if we're not being obedient, we're actually missing out on nourishment. Yeah. It's a strengthening, it's a sustaining, it's a growing experience to be obedient to God.
Okay, so again, like this is Real Sisters, Real Talk. We're just in the moment processing this out. So if our sustenance comes from obedience and not just sitting in his presence, then truthfully, I'm missing out on incredible blessing if I am just taking it in and not doing the work that God has called me to do.
I mean, the whole, like, we have t-shirts, right? All I need is mascara and Jesus.
Yeah.
If we're not stepping into obedience, if we're not doing the things that God has called us to do, the things that he said in the secret place, we're not being nourished. We're not being strengthened in our walk with the Lord. In other words, if I were to be so blunt, you can't hear from God and be disobedient and be strengthened. That's a pretty strong statement. But following the example of Jesus, and Jesus saying, my obedience to God is my nourishment. It is my food.
Yeah.
There's something in there for us.
Absolutely is. Yeah. And I think, it goes back to the thing too of, I just used the word we were invited into, and I use that word because it makes it easier for me to accept it as an invitation than a command. Because again, I have not been obedient. So that softens the blow. But John 14:15 says, if you love me, keep my commands. Do what I've told you to do. That will show our love for God. Not to receive his love, not so that he will love us, but because he does. And so really by being disobedient, I'm actually not loving God the way that I'm supposed to love him. But I think I changed that wording to make it palatable for me not to do it.
I do too. I know. This is painful.
Right?
Okay, so I have something I'm going to float out there. Are you familiar with Dr. Gary Chapman and the Five Love Languages?
My goodness, yes.
Okay, like
love that book. The Five Love. I mean, it's honestly really popular even outside of the Christian community. It's just so good. Yeah.
Totally. So I have read that book. I'm very familiar with that material.
You've interviewed him, haven't you?
Yeah, I've interviewed him a few times, and we had a dinner to honor him. I was at his table, that sort of thing. So he is phenomenal. The guy's so good. Yeah. So in one of my conversations with him, I was like, I have this theory that I want to float out to you, Mr. Five Love Languages.
Ooh, like, that was brave.
As if he hadn't already thought about this. Here's a thought you might not have had. Anyway, I think about this a lot, but it comes from the text that you just shared, right? I think if God had a love language, it would be obedience. In other words, that text says to me that God feels loved by me. I don't love him so that he will love me.
No.
I obey him. Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. I don't obey him so that he'll love me. I obey him because I want him to know how much I love him.
Yes. It's our action to the love that we have for him. It's
how he, just like if you're not familiar with the Five Love Languages, it's the way in which we feel loved. And it might be physical touch. It might be words of affirmation. It might be acts of service. It might be quality time. And then there's another one. That one.
Yep.
It might be gifts. But it's the way in which if somebody does that for us, we feel loved by them, like they're speaking our love language. I think maybe God's love language is obedience, because when we are obedient to him, he experiences and feels our love for him.
It's an acting out. It's the feet to the love, right? It's the thing. So what did Gary Chapman answer? I have to know. Do you remember?
Yeah, he was like, interesting.
Non-committal.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be his next book or anything. Yeah, but it was kind of fun to be able to float that out to him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it does make sense, because it is absolutely a way that we can actually show our love is by obedience. And can we just say we just need to obey? Mm-hmm. We just need to obey. And that's so much easier to say than to do, because I'm still holding this thing that I'm supposed to do. There's actually two things. There's also some scripture that I feel like the Lord, I'm going to say again, invited me to memorize.
Sure. Did he?
Because it was an invitation years ago, and I just haven't done it.
Yeah.
I've done part of it, but I need to get that done, and I feel this weight of it. Why would I not do that? Why would I not put that scripture in me when I know that that's for my benefit? Why am I being disobedient in it? Why am I dragging my feet? Because it takes a little bit of work. There's no risk in it.
Right. One of my favorite verses, and I just say it all the time, is that all the days planned for you were written in God's book before even one of them came to be. And then, God has these good works that he planned in advance for us to step into. So like, it's all teed up for us. We just got to show up and swing.
Yes.
And
why don't we show up
struggle?
and swing?
It's a struggle sometimes.
Yeah.
I don't know, but this reminds me of a story. It was Elizabeth Elliot who told this story, and it was about her little brother. She said she grew up in a home where there's just things in our home that, this is the culture, this is how we do what we do. And one of those things was when you played with the toys in the playroom, before you moved on to the next thing, you had to pick up the toys and put them back where they went, and then you moved on to the next thing. Well, they were playing with the toys. Her little brother was playing with toys, and it was time for him to do his practice piano for his piano lesson. And he had not picked up his toys. And he moved on to the piano, and he started playing, and he started singing, and he was singing a psalm or a hymn.
Okay.
It was a praise song to God. And Elizabeth Elliot remembers this moment that mom walked in the room and saw the toys laying on the floor and heard her son playing the piano and singing praises to God. And she says, "Son, there is no sense in singing praises to God if you're not being obedient."
Wow. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, there sit the toys, not doing what mom had told him to do and singing God's praises. And that one hits because there are often times, we're walking in disobedience and our lips are praising,
right,
but our feet aren't going the places that God has called us to go.
Yeah, so that took a turn for me. But what I was thinking when you were sharing that story was so often not so often, always, the things that God calls us to be obedient in are so often for our benefit, right? Mm-hmm. Like if this little guy didn't pick up his toys and moved to the next thing and didn't pick up that and moved to the next thing and didn't pick up that, then there's this overwhelming task when it's time to clean up. But if we're just obedient and we continue to clean up, then it makes our life so much better. Isn't that true with everything that God calls us to? If we're obedient with the thing that he tells us to be obedient with, there's benefit from being obedient as well. And so
I've got a silly little story that I need to share with you that really illustrates what you were just talking about right now, as far as like the benefits of being obedient. So I was doing my quiet time. I was sitting with the Lord, and I had this intruding thought. It was like 6 a.m. Let me just frame up the day really quickly. I had a teaching coming up, and I needed quiet time and space to be alone, because it doesn't come for me if I'm not alone. I need to be alone with the Lord and prepare my content. And the day was all framed up like, my husband had somewhere he needed to be. He had a meeting at church. Everybody was going to be leaving, and I was going to have this time and space to myself. So before any of that started, I'm just sitting with the Lord. I'm not working on my content or anything. I'm just having my quiet time. And this intruding thought comes in: wash the dog. I do not have a little dog.
Right.
I have a big dog.
Yeah.
Large. It was at that time Roxy, our black lab, large black lab. And I'm like, it is 6 a.m.
In Michigan.
I have a huge dog. Everybody's asleep. Like, I'm not going to wash the dog right now. Why would I wash the dog at 6 o'clock in the morning?
Yeah.
So I push the thought aside, and I keep doing my quiet time. And then it comes back again: wash the dog. And I'm like, I have learned that this is the voice of God. This is not just a random thought.
Yep.
So I have sticky notes next to where I sit and do my quiet time, so I can jot that stuff down, because I want to make sure I get to it. Sometimes it's a call so-and-so or whatever.
Write a note.
And I'll write a note so that I don't forget it. So I did that. So I carry on with my quiet time. Anyway, it happened several times, and I was like, yep, sticky, got it,
God.
Keep moving on. Anyway, my husband wakes up, and he's like, hey, have you let the dog out yet? And I was like, nope, not yet. And he's like, I got it. So he goes down there to let her out, and it turns out the night before she had been brought in, she had gotten into something, and she needed a bath. And he's like, Roxy got into such and such. And he's like, I'll give her a bath real quick. And I was like, seriously? And he's like, yeah. And I was like, thank you so much. So he washes the dog, but the time that it took to wash the dog pushed him back in his morning. So he's like, you know what? I'm just going to take my meeting from home instead of heading into the office. Like, the whole day got derailed at that moment because he was kind enough to stay home and wash the dog. It meant that he stayed home, and the space, like the 5 hours that I was expecting to get to be able to sit and have that time to work on what I needed to work on with the Lord, it didn't exist on that day. And I just remember sitting down and seeing that sticky note, wash the dog. And I'm like, the Lord was literally telling me, wash the dog. Like now.
It will save your day.
It was save your day. And I missed it. But there was a blessing. There was on the other side of the obedience to what God was telling me to do that I missed out on because I chose not to obey.
Yeah. And, part of it, sometimes it's hard to discern, is this a distraction or is this
that's true.
an obedience? And so very sweetly, God showed you, I was telling you. Wash. I was actually giving you a gift.
And you don't expect God to say,
wash the dog.
Thou shalt wash thy dog.
Right?
Yeah, there was no Charlton Heston voice going on in my head. It was just, there it was.
Yeah. So I have a couple of C.S. Lewis quotes written down.
Yeah, buddy.
Just, so good. But one of them was, C.S. Lewis says, I was not born to be free. I was born to adore and to obey. We were born to obey God.
Yeah.
That is what we are meant to do.
Yeah, it's what we're created for.
It's what we're created for, to bring him glory and to worship him. And yet I battle and fight and try to make all kinds of excuses all the time. So I just thought that was really interesting. One more quote from C.S. Lewis. He says, and this is interesting in light of the story you just shared, obedience is the road to freedom. Because actually God knows best what is best. And God, the other thing I talk about all the time is that God's perspective is this huge umbrella over the entire world and what is happening. My view is me, I, myself, me.
Yeah.
How this impacts me.
Right.
How this revolves around me. And so do I think that my perspective is more insightful than God's plan and his perspective? And so I really need to trust him and obey and do what he's calling, not inviting me, but telling me to do.
Right. I think I'm so grateful that we grew up with the dad that we grew up with.
Yeah.
And one of the ways in which obedience, I see the connection in obedience to love through what dad modeled for us. Because for instance, we had curfew was midnight and you had to be home by midnight, and 12:01 was not midnight.
Right.
You know what I mean? You needed to be home by midnight. And I wanted to be home by midnight, not because, I'm going to get in so much trouble if I'm not home by midnight, but because I love my dad so much. I love my dad and my mom, and I respect them, and I don't want to mess up that relationship. I want that relationship to be good. So obedience was motivated as a kid, at home, was motivated by relationship.
Yes.
And that's the same, we've said many times, he's the king, I tell you. When he tells us to do something, we need to do it. True, but also, man, out of love relationship for God, and not because his love for us is dependent on whether we obey him or not, because he is love. He's going to love you no matter what. He's going to love you whether you're obedient or not obedient. You're going to miss out on some blessings if you choose disobedience.
Absolutely.
Over obedience, or you delay your obedience rather than being obedient. But obedience is for the purpose of love.
Yeah.
And relationship.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just a reminder, just to say it again, we obey because of our love for God, not to earn love from him, because his love is a gift. It is already given.
Yeah. John 8:32 says, if you hold to my teaching, you're really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. I think that I don't know that we can have the conversation of obedience outside of discipleship, or discipleship outside of obedience. Obedience is a part of following Jesus and walking in his footsteps.
Absolutely.
So good.
Good reminder.
Yeah. I think it was Craig Rochelle. I've got a quote here. Where is it? Yep. He said, you have no idea what might set in what might get set in motion through a single act of obedience.
And isn't that true? Like I know you and I could tell story after story of that, of what comes because of an act of obedience.
Yeah.
And what a beautiful thing. So we go back to, a couple episodes ago, sometimes we just need to remember.
Yeah.
And that gives us, that shouldn't be what gives us the motivation. Just wanting to be obedient to God should be our motivation.
Yeah.
And wanting to express our love to Him. But we need to remember. Those things help us walk in the truth of who He is.
And mature.
Yeah.
As people who are following Jesus, our obedience, I've heard it said that the measure of maturity is the distance between hearing God's voice and our obedience.
Oh my goodness.
Which hurts a little bit, seeing how we started this conversation, this specific episode, because I started talking about my delayed obedience.
Yes.
And
can we just say that delayed obedience is disobedience?
Right, yeah.
We did talk about that.
It is. But I want to close the gap.
Yeah, me too.
You know, between hearing from God and being obedient to Him. And I know that you do too. And just thank you for being here with us for the conversation today. I hope that you have a blessed day. And I do pray that if you're thinking right now, like, all right, I feel charged up, I'm ready to obey, but I don't know what God has for me. I don't know what I'm supposed to step into today. Ask Him.
Yep.
And spend time in the Word. And I believe that God will reveal to you exactly what He has for you, exactly for today. And then I pray that you would walk in that you would show your love for Him by being obedient to Him. So thanks for being with us today. Just want to remind you, as we always do, we serve a real God, and He really loves you.